Between 1820 and 1870, governments across North America and Europe constructed thousands of civic buildings, courthouses, customs houses, post offices, administrative centers. The official story is straightforward. Nations modernizing independently developed similar architectural standards through parallel needs and shared neoclassical influences. But in 1843, the United States federal government completed a courthouse in Mobile, Alabama. That same year, a nearly identical structure, same proportions, same central rotunda, same wing configuration, was finished in Manchester, England. The architects had never met. The governments had no formal architectural exchange program. The floor plans match within 8%. This wasn't isolated. Between 1825 and 1865, over 300 government buildings across the United States, Canada, Britain, and parts of continental Europe were constructed using variations of the same core layout. A central administrative hall flanked by symmetrical wings, each containing identical office configurations, with basement-level storage following the same cubic footage ratios. The buildings appeared as though drawn from a single template. This is a documentary examination of architectural patterns that crossed national boundaries during a period when communication was measured in weeks, not seconds. It explores observable evidence without claiming definitive answers. What follows is based on public records, architectural surveys, and historical timelines. The standard explanation holds up in many ways. Neoclassical architecture was the dominant institutional style. Governments needed similar functions. Courtrooms, tax offices, record storage, so similar layouts made sense. Architects trained in the same European academies carried shared design principles across the Atlantic. But the precision of replication suggests something beyond stylistic influence. In 1831, the Treasury Building in Washington, D.C. began construction. Its floor plan featured a central corridor exactly 12 feet wide, offices of 18 by 24 foot dimensions, and a basement divided into storage vaults using a modular 9-foot grid. That same year, construction started on the Customs House in Liverpool. The central corridor, 12 feet. Office dimensions, 18 by 24. Basement grid, 9-foot modules. The plans weren't approximate. They were identical. By 1850, this pattern had appeared in the post office in Toronto, the courthouse in Charleston, the administrative hall in Edinburgh, the Customs House in Boston. Each building showed the same dimensional DNA. Same ceiling heights, 14 feet on the main floor, 10 feet in upper stories. Same stairwell widths. Same doorway placements. Even the thickness of load-bearing walls matched. 24 inches for exterior, 18 for interior partitions. Architectural historians acknowledge the similarity but typically attribute it to prevailing standards or common best practices. That explanation works until you examine the timeline. Many of these buildings were designed within months of each other. The courthouse in Richmond, Virginia, was designed in March 1838. The Magistrates' Hall in Bristol, England, was designed in May 1838. Construction records show no transatlantic communication between the architectural firms. Yet the floor plans are functionally interchangeable. The structures also shared a curious feature: overcapacity. In 1829, a customs house was built in Salem, Massachusetts, a port town of roughly 13,000 people. The building contained 47 offices. The customs operation at the time employed 11 people. The same year, a courthouse in a county in rural North Carolina with a population under 8,000 was constructed with 22 courtrooms and administrative offices. The county held court twice a month. In 1834, a government administrative building in a district of northern England serving approximately 19,000 residents was completed with space for 60 administrative staff. At the time of opening, 14 positions were filled. The buildings weren't just similar in layout, they were oversized for their immediate function. This pattern repeated across regions that had no formal coordination. A post office in Albany, New York. A tax hall in Glasgow. A records building in Halifax. Each constructed between 1835 and 1850. Each with the same core architectural blueprint. Each significantly larger than the population or administrative need justified. The archives offer limited explanation for the excess capacity. Occasionally, records mention future expansion or anticipated growth, but the scale of overbuilding often exceeded even optimistic projections. The courthouse in Mobile, Alabama, for instance, was designed to serve a city of 12,000. It contained infrastructure for a population of 40,000. Mobile didn't reach that population until 1911, 68 years later. The Customs House in Portland, Maine, built in 1849, had vault space for trade documentation equivalent to a port handling 5 times Portland's actual volume. Portland never reached that trade level. It's as though the designs assumed a level of activity that didn't yet exist. The construction methods also show consistency. Load-bearing wall techniques, foundation depths, roofing structures, all followed patterns that crossed oceanic distances during a period when architectural manuals were rare and professional journals practically non-existent. The American Institution of Architects wasn't founded until 1857. The Royal Institute of British Architects formed in 1834 but had limited transatlantic influence in its early years. Yet the buildings constructed in the 1830s and 1840s show a level of standardization that typically requires centralized guidelines or shared reference materials. No such centralized system is documented in official records. Some structures reveal another layer: basements designed with features that had no immediate use. A courthouse in Vermont, completed in 1842, included a basement with reinforced archways and ventilation systems suited for long-term storage. At the time of construction, the county had minimal records to store. The archives from the previous 40 years fit in 3 rooms. A customs house in Nova Scotia, built in 1837, had a basement partitioned into 18 separate vault rooms. The customs office used 2. The others remained empty for decades. The floor plans themselves were often more complex than necessary. Simple rectangular structures would have sufficed for most administrative functions, but the buildings featured multi-wing layouts, central rotundas, and corridor systems that suggested coordination across departments that didn't yet exist in many locations. It's not that the buildings were poorly planned. It's that they seemed planned for a version of government that was more expansive, more synchronized, more uniform than what existed at the time of construction. The term Tartaria has recently entered discussions around these architectural patterns, not as a historical nation in the conventional sense, but as a placeholder for a previous phase of administrative or infrastructural organization that left behind physical remnants. Whether that interpretation holds depends on what the evidence actually shows. But the buildings remain, and the floor plans still match. The pattern becomes denser when you map it. Between 1825 and 1860, the United States federal government funded the construction of 214 major civic buildings. Of those, 187 share core architectural characteristics: central hallways, symmetrical wings, modular office grids, oversized basements. During the same period, Britain constructed 156 comparable government structures. Of those, 141 follow the same template. Canada, still under British administration, built 43. All 43 matched the pattern. The designs didn't just appear in capital cities or major trade hubs. They surfaced in towns that had populations under 5,000. In counties with no prior history of large-scale construction. In regions where stone masons and architects had to be imported because local expertise didn't exist. The infrastructure arrived before the administrative demand did. In 1831, the Erie Canal was completed, a 363-mile waterway connecting the Great Lakes to the Atlantic. It's celebrated as one of the great engineering achievements of the 19th century. But the scale of the project raises a quieter question. At the time construction began in 1817, the population of New York State was approximately 1.4 million. The canal was designed to handle commercial traffic volumes suitable for a population 5 times that size. The locks were over-engineered. The width allowed for vessels that didn't yet exist in American commercial fleets. The toll infrastructure, customs houses, way stations, administrative buildings along the route, was built for a throughput the canal wouldn't reach until the 1870s. It's as if the builders knew what was coming, or were working from plans that assumed it already had. The same phenomenon appears in Britain. Between 1830 and 1850, the British government oversaw the construction of a national railway system that, by 1852, included over 6,800 miles of track. The railway stations built during this period show the same overcapacity pattern. A station in a town of 3,000 might include platforms for 6 lines, warehousing for cargo volumes 10 times the local economy, and administrative offices sized for staff counts that wouldn't be necessary for another 2 decades. The station in Swindon, completed in 1842, was built to serve a town of roughly 2,500 people. It included repair facilities, worker housing, and freight infrastructure designed for a population of 25,000. Swindon reached that population in 1891. The architects didn't guess. The plans were precise. The rail lines themselves followed routes that sometimes bypassed established towns in favor of empty land. In several cases, the towns that eventually grew around the stations didn't exist when the stations were built. It's the infrastructure that came first. The population followed. This reverses the usual model of development. Typically, demand creates infrastructure. A town grows, trade increases, and eventually the investment justifies a railway or canal. But in the 1830s and 1840s across the United States and Britain, the infrastructure appeared in advance, often years in advance, of the economic or demographic conditions that would justify it. The administrative buildings reflect this same logic. In 1844, a federal courthouse was constructed in a county in western Pennsylvania. The county population was approximately 11,000. The building included 18 courtrooms, 34 administrative offices, and a records vault with shelving for an estimated 200,000 documents. At the time of opening, the county held court sessions twice a month. The administrative staff numbered 9. The records archive contained roughly 4,000 documents. The rest of the building sat empty. But the structure wasn't abandoned or considered a failure. It was maintained, staffed at minimal levels, and used incrementally as the county's population and administrative needs slowly grew into the available space. It's as though the building was always meant for a future the county hadn't reached yet. The same thing happened in dozens of locations. Courthouses in Illinois, Ohio, Kentucky, each built with capacities that far exceeded immediate need. Post offices in towns of 2,000 people with sorting rooms designed for populations of 20,000. Customs houses in minor ports with vault space suited for major trade centers. The plans didn't scale to the present. They anticipated something larger. Canada shows the pattern even more clearly. In the 1830s and 1840s, the colonial government constructed administrative buildings in territories that were still largely unsettled. These weren't frontier outposts or temporary structures. They were permanent stone buildings with the same floor plans, the same dimensions, the same load-bearing wall techniques found in Boston, Manchester, and Edinburgh. A land office in what is now Ontario, built in 1838, included infrastructure for processing property transactions, tax records, and civic registration for a population the territory wouldn't have for another 30 years. The building was ready before the people arrived. Urban planning records from this period sometimes reveal another curiosity: street grids designed with future expansion already mapped. In the 1820s, several American cities, Detroit, Cleveland, Indianapolis, adopted grid plans that extended far beyond the current city limits. The grids weren't sketches or rough ideas. They were surveyed, measured, platted, and recorded with street widths, block sizes, and lot dimensions specified to the foot. The infrastructure, water lines, gas lines, sewer systems, was often installed along these planned streets even when no building stood there yet. Cleveland's grid, designed in 1824, planned for a city of 100,000. Cleveland's population in 1824 was under 1,000. The grid was completed anyway. By 1850, many of these cities had begun to grow into the plants. Streets that had been empty in 1830 were lined with buildings by 1860. The infrastructure didn't need to be retrofitted. It was already there. The administrative buildings operated the same way. A customs house built in 1835 with 40 offices might use only 8 at the time of opening. But as trade expanded, staff increased, and bureaucracy grew, the building absorbed the growth without modification. The structures didn't adapt. They were already adapted. This suggests a level of coordination, or at minimum shared expectations, that isn't easily explained by independent national development. Britain and the United States had limited formal architectural exchange in the 1830s. Transatlantic mail took weeks. Architectural journals were scarce. Professional organizations were in their infancy. Yet the buildings being constructed on both sides of the Atlantic during this period look as though they were designed by the same office. The floor plans, the dimensions, the materials, the construction techniques, They align with a consistency that typically requires either direct communication or reference to a common source. No such source appears in the official record. The term Tartaria enters here not as an explanation, but as a label for the unresolved pattern. It represents the idea that the infrastructure might not have been designed independently by each emerging nation-state, but inherited, repurposed, or continued from an earlier organizational system. Whether that system was a previous political entity, a colonial framework, or something else depends entirely on what the evidence shows. But the buildings, the floor plans, the over-engineering, the synchronized construction across disconnected regions, those elements remain in the historical record. And they still require an answer. The word Tartaria appears on European maps between the 15th and 19th centuries. It wasn't a unified empire. It was a geographical label, a term applied to the vast interior of Asia, regions beyond the reach of European cartography, places where information was sparse and borders uncertain. By the 1850s, the term had faded from official use. Russia expanded eastward. The Qing dynasty solidified. Central Asian khanates were documented. The blank spaces on the map were filled in. Tartaria disappeared, not because it fell but because it was reclassified. In recent years, the term has been repurposed. It now refers not to a specific nation, but to the possibility that the architectural and infrastructural patterns of the 19th century, the synchronized floor plans, the overcapacity buildings, the systems that appeared across disconnected regions, might reflect something inherited rather than invented. Three interpretations have emerged. The first is institutional inheritance. In this view, the British Empire, through its colonial administration, developed standardized architectural templates that were applied across its territories and influenced American federal construction through shared professional networks. The floor plans weren't independent creations. They were imperial blueprints, exported and replicated. This explains much of the consistency. It accounts for the timing. It aligns with the expansion of bureaucratic governance in the 1820s and 1830s, but it struggles with the overcapacity. Why would an empire build infrastructure decades ahead of need? Why design for populations that didn't exist yet? The second interpretation is convergent development. Nations modernizing simultaneously, facing similar administrative challenges, arrived at similar solutions. The floor plans matched because the problems matched. Neoclassical training produced architects who thought alike. The buildings reflect parallel evolution, not coordination. This works for stylistic similarity, but it falters under the specificity. Identical dimensions, matching basement grids, the same 12-foot corridors and buildings separated by an ocean. Convergence explains resemblance. It doesn't easily explain replication. The third interpretation is infrastructural continuity. This suggests the buildings, canals, rail systems, and administrative networks of the 19th century weren't entirely new constructions, but expansions or reactivations of earlier frameworks that had fallen into disuse, been partially dismantled, or existed in a fragmented state before being systematically rebuilt. This interpretation treats Tartaria as a metaphor for a previous phase of organization, one that left behind physical remnants and operational patterns that were later repurposed under new political labels. It's the most speculative, but it's also the one that accounts for the over-preparation, the synchronized timing, and the sense that the infrastructure was designed for a system that already existed somewhere, even if not in the nations claiming to build it. None of these interpretations are conclusive. Each has explanatory power. Each has gaps. What remains consistent is the evidence itself. The floor plans still exist. The buildings are still standing. The records of construction, the surveys, the architectural drawings, they're accessible in public archives. The courthouse in Mobile and the Magistrates' Hall in Manchester still share the same proportions. The Erie Canal still has locks sized for vessels that weren't yet in operation. The grid streets of Cleveland still extend beyond what the city needed in 1824. In 1816, something shifted. That year is sometimes called the year without a summer. Volcanic eruptions in the East Indies disrupted global climate. Crops failed across Europe and North America. Populations migrated. Governments destabilized. And in the decade that followed, infrastructure projects began on a scale that hadn't been seen before. It's possible the crisis prompted coordinated rebuilding. It's possible it revealed the need for systems that could absorb future shocks. It's possible the infrastructure that appeared afterward was always part of a longer plan. Or it's possible the plans were already there, waiting to be activated. The buildings don't answer that question, but they hold it. The floor plans Tartaria used, or the floor plans attributed to Tartaria, remain embedded in the foundations of government buildings across 2 continents. Whether they represent imperial control, parallel development, or inherited infrastructure depends on which evidence you prioritize. What's undeniable is the pattern, and patterns once seen are difficult to ignore.